Before the factories began their morning roar, before the clatter of hooves echoed down the brick-paved streets, Willow Creek lay in a kind of quiet only a harbor city can know. The tide had gone out hours earlier, leaving the air faintly salted and carrying the distant creak of wooden masts in the docks. Along Main Street, the gas lamps still burned with a soft hiss, their yellow glow clinging stubbornly to the damp morning air, as though unwilling to yield to the coming daylight. It was the spring of 1874, and Willow Creek was not yet the kind of place to make headlines in the national papers, but it was a city on the rise. The railroad had reached it only 5 years earlier, stitching the port to the booming industrial centers inland. With the trains came goods coffees from Brazil, wool from the northern states, barrels of molasses from the Caribbean, and with goods came people. Irish dock workers hauled crates on bent backs. German craftsmen opened neat little workshops near the market square. Young women from nearby farming towns arrived with carpet bags and folded dresses, hoping to find work as mistresses or housemaids in the growing hotels near the wharf. At dawn, the city carried a mixture of old and new. Wooden shop fronts with hand-painted signs stood beside, brick warehouses whose upper windows were already glowing with lamplight from clerks starting their day. The streets were lined with hitching posts and watering troughs, though more and more, iron rails for the new streetcars ran alongside them. Down by the waterfront, the warehouses loomed in the fog, their silhouettes broken by the slow movement of cranes lifting cargo from the holds of ships. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath turning to pale clouds in the chill. The teamsters worked in rhythm with the tide, their boots crunching on damp cobblestones, their voices low but steady. The air was a mix of salt tar, fresh bread from the baker's shop on Market Street, and the sharper tang of coal smoke from the ironworks up on the hill. On this particular morning, however, something was amiss. The gas lamps along the eastern stretch of Main Street, near the old courthouse, remained lit long after the others had been extinguished. Normally, the lamplighter, Mr. Fitch, a wiry man with a bowler hat and a pocket watch always in hand, would have made his rounds just after dawn, snuffing out each lamp in turn. But there was no sign of him. The lamps burned steadily, almost unnaturally steady, their glass panes gleaming like watchful eyes in the fading mist. Those who noticed did not think much of it. Lamps went out when they went out. Sometimes the valves stuck, and sometimes the lamplighter simply missed one. Yet there was something about the way they glowed that made them hard to ignore. At the far edge of town, where the houses grew smaller and the streets turned to dirt, a young schoolteacher named Clara Price stepped out of her boarding house. She fastened her cloak against the cool air, tucking a strand of dark hair beneath her bonnet. The road to the schoolhouse was familiar, lined with budding elms and whitewashed fences, but that morning her eyes kept straying toward the lamps, still burning in the distance. Clara was not a superstitious woman, but the sight stirred an old memory, her father's voice, telling her stories of ships that left harbor with their lanterns lit in daylight, only to vanish at sea. She smiled faintly at the thought, dismissing it as foolishness. Still, as she walked, she found herself glancing back again and again to that strange, steady glow on Main Street. By the time she reached the schoolyard, the children were already gathering, their breath puffing in the cool air, their voices carrying in the crisp morning stillness. But even as she unlocked the door and stepped inside, the image of those stubbornly burning lamps lingered in her mind. as if they were keeping watch over something the rest of the city had yet to notice. The morning in Willow Creek unfolded with its usual deliberate pace. The streetcars clanged their bells as they rolled along the rails, their polished brass fittings catching the first honest sunlight of the day. On the corner of Ash and Market, Mrs. Penwell was arranging jars of preserves in the window of her shop, lining them so that the deep reds and golden ambers seemed to glow from within. Across the street, two boys carried buckets of water from the pump, sloshing half their load onto the dust as they argued about who could run faster. But along the eastern stretch of Main Street, the atmosphere felt different. The gas lamps, still lit, cast a pale gold light that no longer belonged to the morning. The mist had burned away, but the flames continued to flicker, their reflections dancing in the glass of shop fronts that had not yet opened for the day. A few passers-by paused to comment. Mr. Hadley, the watchmaker, noted it with a shrug, saying the valves sometimes jammed in damp weather. Mrs. Green from the millinery remarked that Mr. Fitch must have been called away, but the absence of the lamplighter was not a common thing. Mr. Fitch had worked the lamps of Willow Creek for over 20 years. Rain or snow, sickness or storm, he could be found in the early dawn, his ladder over one shoulder, his long-handled snuffer in the other. He was a small, wiry man with sharp eyes that seemed to measure everything he saw. Most people knew him only as a polite nod in the street, but those who spoke to him learned he kept a mental map of every lamp in the city. When each had been installed, how often the mantles needed replacing, and which poles leaned a little more each year under the weight of the wind. By mid-morning, his absence had reached the ears of the Willow Creek Gazette. Inside the newspaper office, a narrow building that smelled faintly of ink and damp paper, a young reporter named Samuel Grady was leaning over the desk of the editor. Samuel was new to the trade, barely 20, with ink stains on his cuffs and the habit of writing notes on whatever scrap of paper he could find. Fitch didn't light the harbor lamps last night either, Samuel said, lowering his voice as though the information were somehow sensitive. Dock workers say they were still burning when they arrived at first light. That's 2 nights in a row. The editor, Mr. Tolson, was a broad-shouldered man with graying sideburns and little patience for gossip. He waved a dismissive hand. Write it down if you think it's worth ink, Grady. Just don't expect it to sell papers unless Fitch turns up floating in the river. Still, Samuel wrote it down. There was something in the pattern of the thing, something in the idea of lamps burning when they ought not to, that seemed worth remembering. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Clara Price was walking home for her midday meal. The children had been restless in their lessons, fidgeting as though the cool spring air had carried some hidden energy into the room. She passed the old stone church, its spire casting a long shadow over the square, and then the row of boarding houses where laundry hung like pale flags in the breeze. When she reached the corner where Main Street bent toward the river, she saw them again, the lamps, burning bright in the daylight. They seemed almost brighter now, their flames sharp and clear, untouched by the gusts of wind that carried the scent of the sea. She slowed her steps without meaning to, her gaze fixed on the nearest lamp. For a moment, she thought she saw movement reflected in the glass like the shadow of a figure passing close, though there was no one near enough to cast it. She blinked, and the glass showed only the wavering flame. The sound of a carriage wheel snapping her out of her thoughts, Clara moved on. The city was busy now. Wagons rattled over the cobblestones, street vendors called out their goods, and the steam whistle from the textile mill let out its noon cry. Life in Willow Creek went on as it always had, yet the burning lamp stayed in her mind like a question without an answer. That evening, as the sun sank behind the low hills to the west, Samuel Grady made his way toward the eastern end of Main Street. He wanted to see for himself if the lamps were still alight after dark. The street was quiet, the shop windows shuttered, the cobblestones bathed in the last orange light of the day. The lamps burned steadily, their glow gathering strength as the sky deepened. He paused under one, looking up at the glass. The flame inside did not flicker, it burned as though protected from the wind entirely. He reached into his coat pocket for his notebook, intending to jot down the time, when a sound reached his ears. It was faint, almost swallowed by the hush of evening. A metallic click, followed by the softest scrape-like metal on glass. Samuel turned sharply, scanning the street, but it was empty. Only the steady burn of the lamps remained. The night had drawn in fully by the time Samuel Grady left the eastern end of Main Street. The lamps glowed like sentinels, their light forming perfect circles on the damp stones. He had intended to return straight to his small room above the Gazette office, but instead, his steps carried him toward the docks. Something in the faint click he had heard earlier clung to his mind, urging him to see if the same strange steadiness of the flame could be found elsewhere in the city. The waterfront was quieter now. The masts of the ships swayed gently against the dark sky, their rigging creaking in the tide's slow pull. Most of the warehouses were shut, their doors barred, but here and there, a single lamp outside a tavern or boarding house spilled light onto the street. Samuel took note of each one, and more than once, he paused to compare their flames with those on Main Street. Ordinary gaslight wavered. It bent in the wind, shivered in passing drafts. But the eastern lamps burned without the smallest tremor. Near Pier 3, he found someone who might know more. Old Jonas, a dockhand who had worked the harbor since before the war, was sitting on an overturned crate, pipe smoke curling around his face. Samuel greeted him, then asked when he had last seen Mr. Fitch. Jonas tapped ash from his pipe. 2 nights ago. Came down this way just after sunset. Had his ladder with him, same as always. Stopped by the harbor lamps, fiddled with one for a bit. Then walked off toward the old customs house, not seen him since. The old customs house was a squat brick building that had been shuttered for nearly a decade. Trade had moved to the newer offices closer to the railway, and the old place had been left to gather dust. Samuel made a note to see it for himself come daylight. That night, fog rolled in from the harbor, softening the outlines of buildings and muffling the sound of hooves on the cobblestones. Samuel returned to his room and, by the glow of his oil lamp, began to sketch a rough map of Willow Creek. He marked the locations of each lamp that had burned too, steadily, and traced a faint line connecting them. The path curved through the city like a thread, beginning near the courthouse and ending near the customs house. Across town, Clara Price sat by her own lamp, correcting a stack of arithmetic exercises by the fire. She had almost put the morning's unease from her mind when a knock came at the boarding house door. Mrs. Fowler, the landlady, answered, and Clara could just make out a man's voice deep, with the clipped accent of someone from the coast. He asked for directions to the eastern end of Main Street. Mrs. Fowler gave them, and the man's footsteps faded into the night. Curious, Clara moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to see the street. Through the fog, she caught a glimpse of him, a tall figure in a dark coat, carrying something long and thin over his shoulder. For a moment, she thought it was a lamplighter's pole. but it was too slender and it glinted faintly, as though made of polished metal. By morning, the fog had thinned, leaving the city washed clean and quiet. Samuel rose early and walked to the old customs house. Its windows were clouded with dust, its doors chained shut, but the gas lamp at the corner burned brightly, as though it had been polished only yesterday. When he reached up to touch the glass, he found it warmer than it should have been in the cool morning air. Footsteps approached. He turned to find Clara Price watching him, her cloak drawn tight around her shoulders. "You're from the Gazette," she said, more as a statement than a question. "I've seen you taking notes near the lamps." Samuel hesitated. "And you've been noticing them too, haven't you?" She nodded slowly. "I do not know what it means, but I saw someone last night, and I think he may have been carrying something that did not belong to him." The air around the old customs house carried the faint scent of salt and damp brick. Even in daylight, the building seemed to draw shadows toward itself. Its thick, arched windows were filmed over with years of neglect. Their panes rippled and warped, so that the reflections of passing clouds bent strangely across the glass. Samuel stood with his hands in his coat pockets, studying the heavy iron chains that held the front doors shut. Clara stood beside him, her gaze drifting from the locked entrance to the solitary lamppost at the corner, its flame burning with the same unnerving stillness as those on Main Street. "I have walked past here 100 times," Clara said quietly, "but never stopped to look. It feels wrong somehow. Like a room where someone has been waiting far too long." Samuel glanced at her. "Jonas down at the dock says Fitch came this way 2 nights ago. That was the last anyone saw of him." Clara drew her cloak tighter. "And now these lamps burn as if someone lit them for a purpose." The street was quiet except for the slow creak of a sign swinging above a shuttered chandlery across the way. Samuel stepped closer to the lamp, crouching to examine its base. The metal was clean, almost polished, as though it had been tended to only recently. His fingers brushed over something etched faintly into the iron marks that looked deliberate, but were worn by weather. "Numbers," he murmured. "But not in any sequence I've seen for maintenance records." Clara leaned closer. Could it be a date? Before he could answer, a sound came from the alley beside the customs house. It was the distinct clink of metal on stone, followed by the faint scuff of a boot. Both of them turned sharply, but the narrow passage between buildings lay empty, the fog from the harbor drifting lazily across its mouth. Samuel moved toward it, his steps slow, careful. The alley smelled faintly of lamp oil. Midway down, he found a small wooden crate, its lid half pried open. Inside were mantles, the fragile, gauzy sleeves that gave gas lamps their bright white light. Most were new, still wrapped in paper, but one was charred, as though it had burned hotter than it should, leaving a blackened ring where the flame had licked the edge. Clara joined him, peering into the crate. "Someone has been replacing them, but why leave the old one here?" Samuel shook his head. "If Fitch had changed these, he would have locked it. He keeps records on everything." From the far end of the alley, a shadow moved quick, purposeful. Samuel took 2 steps forward, but by the time he reached the corner, the street beyond was empty. Only the echo of retreating footsteps lingered. They returned to the front of the customs house, and Clara pointed toward the second-floor window. Behind the dust and warped glass, something shifted. A slow movement, like a curtain being drawn back. Samuel felt the hairs on his neck rise. "This place has been locked for years," he said under his breath. Clara's voice was steady, but her hands tightened on the folds of her cloak. Then either someone has found a way in, or they never left. They stood there for a long moment, listening to the gulls cry over the harbor, the waves slapping gently against the pilings. The city carried on beyond this quiet corner street cars clanged. Vendors called out their prices, and the steam whistle at the mill marked the hour. Yet here, the air felt separate, sealed away from the ordinary rhythm of Willow Creek. Finally, Samuel stepped back from the door. We cannot force our way in without drawing attention, but there may be another way. Clara looked at him. The back entrance? He nodded. Or the records? If we can find out who still owns this place, we may learn why someone is keeping these lamps burning. They began walking toward the municipal offices, their footsteps echoing softly along the cobblestones. Behind them, the lamp at the corner of the customs house burned with unwavering light, its flame catching in the glass like a watchful eye. The municipal building stood at the far end of Willow Creek Civic Square, a broad sandstone structure whose steps had been worn into gentle curves by decades of foot traffic. Inside, the air smelled of paper, ink, and the faint mustiness of old stone. Tall windows let in filtered light, which fell across long oak counters and shelves heavy with bound ledgers. Samuel removed his hat as he stepped inside. Clara closed behind. A clerk with round spectacles looked up from his work, his pen pausing in mid-sentence. "Property records," Samuel said politely. "We are looking for the ownership history of the old customs house by the eastern harbor." The clerk adjusted his spectacles. "That building has not seen official use in some years." "Why do you wish to know?" Clara answered before Samuel could speak. "We are tracing the maintenance of gas lamps in that part of the city. There may be irregularities." The clerk regarded them for a moment, then nodded and disappeared into a side room. The sound of drawers sliding open echoed faintly before he returned, carrying a thick ledger bound in faded green leather. He placed it on the counter, dust rising as he opened to a page marked by a ribbon. Samuel and Clara leaned in. The earliest entry dated to 1849, when the customs house had been commissioned by the Harbor Authority. For the next 2 decades, its ownership remained with the city, but in 1872, the building was sold not to another government office, but to a private holding company called Mariners Trust. "That name means nothing to me," Clara murmured. Samuel frowned. "Nor to me. But look." He pointed to a notation in the margin, nearly lost in the cramped handwriting. "Maintenance of perimeter lighting to be continued without interruption." The clause appeared in every subsequent record of transfer. The customs house had changed hands 3 more times, yet each new owner had agreed to keep the lamps around the building burning. "That is unusual," the clerk remarked quietly. "When we modernized the harbor lighting 15 years ago, those lamps were left untouched." "Special exemption?" Clara's brow furrowed. "But why? Who would insist on such a thing?" The clerk turned a few more pages and stopped at an entry from 1884. It detailed a renovation of the customs house. Interior, mostly cosmetic repairs, but there was one peculiar note. Vault room on lower level to remain sealed per instruction of ownership. Samuel felt a prickle at the back of his neck. "A vault room?" The clerk nodded. "The plans listed as storage for bonded goods. But if it has remained sealed since before the turn of the century, then whatever is inside has been there a very long time." They thanked the clerk and stepped back into the square. The afternoon sun was warm on the stones, but Samuel's mind was elsewhere. As they walked, Clara spoke softly. "Do you think Fitch might have known about this?" But perhaps he was not only tending the lamps, but guarding something? Samuel considered this. If anyone knew the details of those lamps, it would be him. And if he found reason to believe the vault was important, he might have gone there. But that does not explain why he has not returned. The chime of the clock tower marked the hour. Around them, the square bustled with the usual traffic vendors packing away their stalls, children darting between benches, the hiss of a steam carriage pulling to a halt. But Samuel noticed something amid the noise. A man standing at the far corner, half in shadow, watching them. He wore a dark coat, and even from a distance, Samuel could see the way his gloved hand rested on the handle of a long, slender object slung over his shoulder. The sight sent a ripple of recognition through him. It was the same figure Clara had described the night before. By the time they crossed the square, the man had vanished into the narrow lanes behind the printmaker's shop. They followed, but the maze of back streets soon swallowed all trace of him. When they emerged again near the river, the lamps along the quay were already lit. Their flames burned steady, bright and utterly still, as if holding their breath. The harbor smelled of tar, wet rope, and the faint sweetness of molasses that had seeped into old wood. Samuel and Clara followed the quay toward a low building with flaking blue paint and a sign that read Harbor Registry. It was not a grand place, but Willow Creek's tides passed through its ledgers as surely as water through the inlet. Inside, the room was narrow and dim, its tall shelves crowded with boxes bound in twine. A single gas lamp hissed over the counter, steady in the quiet. Behind that counter stood a woman in her 50s, with ink on her fingers and a pin holding back a coil of gray hair. Her nameplate read Mrs. Keene. She lifted her eyes when the doorbell chimed and nodded once, the kind of greeting one gives to those who might bring more work. "Records," Samuel said, removing his hat. "We are tracing the ownership of the old customs house. Mariners' Trust appears in the city ledgers. We were hoping for the harbor side of the story." Mrs. Keene tapped the counter with a dull pencil. "Paper first, then story." She set out a register and dipped her pen. "Names?" They gave them. She drew the date, the time, and their purpose, then slid the book away and turned to a drawer labeled Private Holdings Archive. It groaned as it opened. From within, she lifted a packet tied with faded red ribbon, placed it on the counter, and untied the knot with a small, neat tug. Inside lay 3 documents: a bill of sale dated 1872, a maintenance schedule from the following spring, and a letter without letterhead. Only a wax seal impressed with a ship's wheel and 7 tiny stars around it. The seal had been broken long ago, but the ring of stars was still clean. The trust was a convenience, Mrs. Keene said. A paper umbrella for men who did not wish to stand in the rain by name. Ship owners, 2 bankers, 1 attorney who liked to be called counselor when no one asked him to be. She did not smile. They bought the customs house when the railway drew trade away from the pier. There were rumors of a bonded vault beneath, never opened in public, always mentioned in private. Clara leaned closer. We saw a note that the lamps were to be maintained without interruption. Mrs. Keene turned the maintenance sheet so the light caught its margins. Someone had penciled codes along the edge, tiny triangles, slashes, and numbers that repeated in sets of 7. "These are routes for a lamplighter," she said. "Not the city's routes, a private circuit." "Fitch," Samuel murmured. "Or the one before him," Mrs. Keene replied. "I remember a man called Avery when I was a girl. He walked with a limp and carried a ledger bound in green. He would come after dark and leave before dawn. The men at the tavern said he had keys to doors that no one else could find. She tapped the unmarked letter and nodded for Samuel to read. The handwriting was tight and angular. To the keeper of lights, the perimeter is to be kept lit at all hours when mist exceeds 2 days. No lamp is to be extinguished while work proceeds below. If the city inquires, refer to civic safety. If asked about the vault, there is no vault. Payment will be made in coin and coal. There was no signature, only the wheel and its ring of 7 stars drawn in ink. Clara felt a small chill run along her arms. Work below, she repeated softly. What kind of work needs lamps above, always burning? Mrs. Keene lifted her chin toward the harbor. The sort that does not like to be seen, and the sort that does not wish anyone to forget where it is. She slid the packet closer to herself, then, after a moment's pause, pushed it back toward Samuel. You did not see the letter here. A footstep sounded in the outer hall. Then the door opened just enough to admit a sliver of gray light and a smell of rain that had no cloud to explain it. A man in a dark coat stood in the doorway, hat low over his brow. He did not enter. He watched the 3 of them for the length of a slow breath, then closed the door without a word. Mrs. Keene's pencil halted. You brought attention, she said quietly. Best to finish. She pulled out a narrow box from beneath the counter. Inside lay a brass tag stamped with the number 17 and a circle of 7 marks. Keys leave marks. Men leave roots. Lamps leave patterns. If you follow them, they lead to doors. She pressed the tag into Samuel's palm. 17 is the harbor lamp on the customs corner. The circle is not decoration. Outside, the afternoon had softened to that pale, uncertain light that belongs to days when the sea thinks of coming inland. Samuel and Clara walked toward the old customs house by the back streets, avoiding the open square. At each corner, Samuel took the tag from his pocket and compared it to the ironwork of the nearest lamp. On 3 posts, there were faint dents that matched the tag's ring of marks, as though something had been pressed there many times before. At the customs corner, the fit was perfect. Try it, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel set the brass against the post and turned it as one might turn a key. At first, nothing moved. Then a quiet click came from within the iron, followed by a deeper sound beneath the stones at their feet, stone sliding over stone, slow and reluctant. They stepped back together as a seam revealed itself at the base of the lamp, a narrow line that widened into a square no larger than a hatch. The smell that rose from the opening was old air, cold and dry, with a trace of lamp oil and something like salt, kept too long in a sealed room. Clara looked at Samuel. If Fitch went below, he used this. Samuel drew a breath that felt heavier than the air itself. Then we go after him. They did not climb down at once. They stood with the evening thickening around them, listening to the hush of the harbor and the faint, steady hiss of the gas above. When they finally began to descend, it was with the careful calm of people who know that some doors, once opened, remember the hands that opened them. The first thing Samuel noticed was the air cold stale, and carrying the faint bite of iron, the narrow hatch yawned before them, the lamplight from above spilling down only far enough to reveal the first 4 rungs of an iron ladder. Beyond that, it was a blackness so complete it seemed to drink the light. He went first, gripping the sides of the ladder. The iron was slick with condensation, and each step groaned faintly under his weight. Clara followed, the sound of her boots and the gentle clink of her skirts against the rungs, echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The ladder descended far longer than either expected, each breath growing colder until they stepped onto solid stone. The chamber they entered was small, circular, and lined with rough-cut blocks that glistened faintly with moisture. A single gas lamp stood on a post in the center, its flame weak and flickering. Samuel bent to examine it, no city mark, only the wheel and 7-star symbol etched into its base. A narrow passage led away from the chamber, its ceiling low enough that Samuel had to bow his head. Their footsteps were muffled by the damp air, but now and then from far off came a faint drip of water or something that mimicked it. They passed alcoves cut into the walls, each containing objects covered in layers of dust, an empty crate marked with shipping codes, a rusted pulley, a bundle of rope turned brittle with age. Clara's hand lingered over one alcove where the wall had been scratched by something sharp, leaving deep grooves. They formed no words she recognized, only shapes, triangles, circles, and that same ring of 7 marks. The passage bent sharply to the right, opening into a longer corridor supported by timber beams. Samuel ran his hand over one and felt where the wood had been replaced in patches, newer sections bolted into the old. "This was reinforced recently," he murmured. Halfway down the corridor, they heard it, a faint shuffle, like fabric brushing stone. Clara froze, eyes wide. The sound came again, closer this time, and then stopped entirely. The silence afterward felt heavier than before, pressing in on their ears. At the corridor's end, they found a heavy door of riveted iron. It had no visible lock, only a small brass disc in the center engraved with the number 17 and the circle of marks. Samuel fit the tag into the groove around the disc and turned it. A muted clunk echoed, followed by the slow grind of metal releasing. The door swung inward to reveal a cavernous chamber, far larger than they had expected to find beneath the customs house. Wooden platforms stretched over a dark expanse of water that filled the chamber's floor. The water was utterly still, black as glass, reflecting the dim glow of several wall-mounted lamps. Clara stepped forward cautiously. "What is this place?" Samuel scanned the far wall. In the wavering light, he saw rows of iron doors set into the stone, each with its own small lamp burning above it. He counted 7. The lamps flickered as if stirred by an unseen draft, though the air was unmoving. From somewhere beyond those doors came a low metallic sound, one steady clang, as though something heavy had been set down. Then silence. Clara clutched Samuel's sleeve. "We are not alone." Samuel tightened his grip on the tag. "No, we are not." The two of them moved along the platform toward the first of the 7 doors. As they passed beneath one of the lamps, Clara noticed the oil reservoir was nearly full and warm to the touch, as if someone had tended it only minutes ago. They stopped before the first door. Its surface was scratched with the same symbols they had seen earlier. Samuel reached for the handle, but before he could touch it, the sound came again, this time from the opposite side of the chamber. A faint ripple spread across the black water, breaking its glassy surface. The ripple on the water spread slowly, lapping against the wooden supports with a sound that seemed far too loud in the stillness. Samuel's eyes stayed fixed on it, waiting for another disturbance, but the surface smoothed as if nothing had moved beneath. "Whatever that was," Clara whispered, "it came from under." Samuel said nothing. He turned his attention to the nearest of the 7 doors. The iron handle was colder than the surrounding air, and when he gripped it, he felt a faint vibration, almost like the hum of a far-off machine. The hinges groaned as he pulled. The door opened only a hand's width before stopping against some unseen barrier. Through the gap, a narrow beam of lamplight fell onto what lay inside, a small chamber lined with crates, each stamped with dates ranging from 1847 to 1853. The markings were in faded black ink, but the words Harbor Authority Bonded were still visible. Clara reached toward one crate, then froze. Samuel, this wood is dry, fresh. He looked closer. She was right. There was no sign of rot or dust. These crates had been placed here recently, even though their markings claimed they were over 40 years old. Before they could examine further, a sound came from the farthest door, 3 slow knocks, spaced evenly apart. Claire's voice was almost a breath. Someone's in here with us. They backed away from the open door, Samuel pulling it shut until the latch clicked. The knocking stopped, but in its place came another sound, the faint scrape of metal sliding in stone, as if one of the distant doors was opening on its own. They moved cautiously along the platform toward the sound. As they drew near, they saw the 7th door farthest from the ladder standing ajar. The lamp above it burned brighter than the others, its flame steady and almost white. Samuel pushed the door open the rest of the way. The chamber beyond was unlike the storage rooms. The walls were smooth stone, polished and damp, and in the center stood a waist-high pedestal. Resting atop it was a brass-bound chest no larger than a shoebox, its surface engraved with the wheel and 7 stars emblem. Clara stepped forward, her breath misting in the cold air. She reached for the lid, but before her fingers touched it, the flame above the door guttered. A shadow passed across the chamber, though there was nothing between them and the light. Then, from somewhere behind them, came the sound of water breaking louder this time, as if something large had moved beneath the surface. Samuel turned sharply, scanning the black pool. A shape slid just below the waterline, too quick to define, but massive enough to send deep ripples to the edges of the platform. The wooden planks shifted under their feet. Clara whispered, "We have to go." But Samuel's gaze stayed on the chest. Not yet. He lifted it from the pedestal. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and the instant it left the stone, every lamp in the chamber flared at once, flooding the space with sharp, almost blinding light. From the water came a deep, resonant sound, part groan, part hiss that seemed to vibrate in their bones. The ripples grew into small waves, slapping against the platform. Something was rising. They ran. The chest thudded against Samuel's side as they sprinted along the planks toward the ladder. The water surged upward behind them, and in the corner of his eye, Samuel caught a glimpse. Pale-scaled skin glistening in the lamplight, the curve of something, like a shoulder or a fin breaking the surface before slipping back into the depths. They reached the ladder and began to climb, the sound of churning water echoing below. As Clara scrambled onto the stone floor above, Samuel cast one last glance down into the chamber. The water was calm again. Still. Too still. And then, just before he pulled himself up, he saw them 2 faint amber lights far below, motionless in the dark water, watching. The hatch closed with a heavy clang, sealing the ladder and the darkness below. Samuel turned the brass tag in the lock until it clicked, the small mechanism swallowing the last echo from the chamber beneath. For a moment, the 2 of them stood in the cold lamplight at the corner of the customs house, breathing hard, neither speaking. The air above ground felt warmer, yet it carried the same faint tang of iron from below, as though the night had followed them up. The chest was heavier than Samuel expected. Even with both hands gripping it, He could feel its weight pulling against his shoulders, as though something inside resisted being moved. The metal bands dug into his palms. Clara glanced down the empty street, her eyes darting to the shadows between buildings, where the light from the lamps thinned into black. "Let's not linger," she said, her voice low, as if the darkness itself might overhear. They took the narrow back lanes toward Samuel's workshop on Willow Street. The cobblestones were slick from the earlier mist, glistening under the weak glow of the lamps. Their footsteps echoed softly, a measured rhythm that seemed too loud in the quiet. The town was stiller than it should have been for the hour. Most windows were shuttered, and even the tavern near the docks, usually spilling lamplight and the low rumble of voices into the street, was silent, its sign swaying gently in the wind. Only the smell of low tide moved through the air, mingling with the faint smoke from unseen chimneys. At one corner, a stray dog stood watching them from the mouth of an alley, its shape barely outlined by the glow of a distant lamp. When Samuel glanced back a moment later, the animal was gone. Inside the workshop, Samuel set the chest on his workbench. It made a deep, dull sound against the wood, the vibration seeming to hum faintly in the floorboards beneath their feet. The brass fittings were tarnished but unbroken, and the engraved wheel and 7-star symbols seemed to catch more light than it should, gleaming faintly in the dim room. Clara stared at it as though expecting it to move. "You think this belonged to the trust?" she asked. Samuel nodded slowly. "Or whoever they were working for? The question is, why hide it down there, behind 7 doors, in a chamber only reachable by a lamppost?" He fetched a chisel and began probing along the seam of the lid. No lock was visible, but the brass edging resisted every movement as though fused to the wood. Clara leaned closer, tracing one fingertip along the engraving. "Feel that," she said. "The stars each has a tiny notch at its center." Samuel examined them under the lamplight. She was right. Each of the 7 stars bore a pinhead-sized indentation, so precisely cut it could not have been accidental. Before he could comment, a sudden knock at the door made them both stiffen. Samuel's hand went to the chisel. Clara stepped back from the bench. The knock came again, 3 slow raps, deliberate, echoing through the wood. Samuel moved to the door and cracked it just enough to see. A boy stood there, no more than 12, his coat too large for him and a flat cap pulled low. His breath fogged in the cold air. He held out a folded scrap of paper. "This is for you, sir," the boy said, his voice flat, not meeting Samuel's eyes. "From the harbor." Samuel took the paper. By the time he looked up again, the boy was already halfway down the street, his steps quick and light, vanishing into the fog as though the night had swallowed him whole. The note was short, written in the same tight, angular hand as the letter Mrs. Keene had shown them. "Do not open the chest in town. Lamps burn for a reason." Clara's voice was barely more than a breath. "They know we took it." Samuel set the note aside and reached for the lamp on the bench. Its flame trembled slightly, though the air in the workshop was still. The glass chimney rattled faintly, as if stirred by a vibration too deep to hear. "If they're watching," he said, "it means whatever's in here isn't just valuable, it's dangerous." Clara's eyes shifted toward the window. Outside, the street lamps were burning steadily, their circles of light cutting into the mist. But at the far end of the lane, one lamp flickered once, then again, before dimming to a sullen ember and going out. The next lamp beyond it followed, the darkness creeping closer in a measured, deliberate line. Neither of them spoke. They simply stood in the quiet, watching the night advance lamp by lamp toward their door. The first lamp's light vanished like a breath snuffed between cupped hands. Then the next went dark, and the one after that, each circle of safety shrinking as though the night itself was folding inward. Samuel felt the air change cooler, heavier, laced with the scent of brine and something faintly metallic. Clara's fingers found the edge of the workbench, holding fast as if bracing against a tide only she could feel. The silence was unnatural. The creak of the tavern sign had stopped. The whisper of the wind down the lane was gone. Even the harbor's distant clang of rigging against masts, a sound that never ceased, was absent. Samuel's lamp was now the only point of light in the room, its glow paling against the darkness pressing at the window. They did not move until the last flicker down the lane was gone. Then Samuel reached for the drawer beneath the bench and pulled out a narrow-barreled pistol, its steel dulled from years of use. "I thought you didn't keep one," Clara said. "I thought I'd never need it." From somewhere beyond the street, a low sound swelled a droning hum, like wind through a cavern, but deeper, almost human in its cadence. It faded after a few seconds, leaving the quiet even sharper. Samuel crossed to the door and cracked it open. The lane outside was not simply dark. It was thick with shadow, the air inside it moving like a slow current. A single figure stood at the far end, motionless. Too far to see the face, but the outline was wrong, shoulders hunched forward, head tilted at an unnatural angle, arms hanging loosely. Clara stepped up behind him. "Close it," she whispered. He did. The latch clicked into place. They worked quickly then, dousing the lamp and moving the chest to the far wall. Samuel pulled a heavy tarpaulin over it. In the near dark, the shape of it became just another shadow among many. For hours they waited, speaking only in low murmurs. Samuel kept to the window, watching for movement. Twice he thought he saw the outline of someone passing, but the figure dissolved before reaching the circle of lamplight from another street. When dawn finally broke, it came reluctantly gray and sluggish, as if the sun itself was hesitant to rise. Samuel stepped outside. The lamps along the lane were unlit, their glass chimneys intact, their oil still full. Yet the wicks were charred to nothing, blackened as though burned for years without being replaced. Down near the docks, a small crowd had gathered around an empty handcart. The fishmonger who used it, Mr. Barlow, had not been seen since the night before. The cart's wheels were damp, and its wooden slats glistened faintly, as if with morning dew, but the air was dry. Clara joined him, her eyes scanning the street. "It's starting, isn't it?" Samuel did not answer. Instead, he led her back toward the workshop. The chest sat where they had left it, but the tarpaulin had shifted. Only an inch, maybe less, but it was enough to reveal the edge of the brass star engraving. Samuel bent to adjust it and froze. The notches in the stars were no longer empty. Each now held a tiny black bead, perfectly round, that seemed to absorb the light around it. Clara stepped closer. "Those weren't there before." "No," Samuel said, straightening. His voice was tight. "And they're not beads." The surface of each bead rippled faintly, as if liquid beneath a thin skin. Samuel had seen something like it once, years ago, when a ship from the Orient brought in a sealed jar of deep-sea creatures preserved in brine. The creatures had eyes that moved, even in death. Outside, a lamp somewhere down the next street hissed faintly, then flared to life on its own, its sudden light spilling into the fog. A moment later, another hissed a light, and another, until the lane was once again lined in pale yellow glow. Samuel and Clara stood frozen. Neither of them believed the return of light meant safety. The lamps burned steadily through the fallen night, their glow almost reassuring, but Samuel and Clara knew better. Light could be a lure as much as a shield. The black, bead-like things in the chest star engravings had not moved. Yet the feeling they gave off, the sense of being watched from inside the metal, lingered like the aftertaste of iron on the tongue. By mid-morning, the streets were cautiously active again. Fishermen hauled their catch toward the market, cartwheels creaked over cobblestones, and the smell of roasting coffee drifted from the corner house on Pearl Street. Yet a certain stiffness lingered in the townspeople's movements. Heads turned quickly at unexpected sounds. Conversations dropped when shadows passed too close. Samuel's decision was sudden. "We need to see if this has happened before," he told Clara as they crossed toward the municipal building. The building stood at the edge of the old square, its red brick walls darkened by decades of salt air. Above the arched doorway, the town's crest, a three-masted ship encircled by sheaves of wheat, was worn almost smooth by weather. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old paper, leather bindings, and the faint mildew that no amount of window opening could banish. A clerk at a tall desk looked up as they entered. He was thin, his spectacles perched low on his nose, and his inkwell nearly empty. Samuel asked for access to public records predating 1800. The clerk hesitated, then led them to a narrow stairwell at the back, descending into a basement lined with shelves. The basement's air was cooler, denser. Rows upon rows of wooden cases filled the space, each stuffed with bound ledgers, rolled maps, and weathered correspondence. Dust motes danced in the beam of their single lantern. Samuel ran his fingers over the spines, reading faded dates, entitled shipping manifests, land deeds, court proceedings, until Clara stopped at a ledger marked unusual incidents. 1748 to 1799. The binding creaked as they opened it on a nearby table. The handwriting was meticulous, each entry dated and signed by the town recorder of the time. Many were small matters: livestock thefts, disputes over fishing rights, reports of strange lights at sea. But one page held them. August 14th, 1763. A line of lamps along Wharf Street extinguished in succession, from the westernmost to the eastern, without wind or visible cause. Witnesses report a figure moving ahead of the darkness, tall and stooped. 2 men did not return home that night. Their families report they were last seen near the customs house. Beneath this was a later entry, October 2nd, 1763. The lamps burn again, yet the unease remains, no trace of the missing. A chest, origin unknown, found sealed beneath the floor of the old watchman's shed, marked with a wheel and 7 stars. Clara looked at Samuel. It's the same, exactly the same. They turned pages, finding scattered entries over the next decades, lamps going out, disappearances, the symbol recurring in odd contexts, a shipment invoice, a sailor's tattoo, a carved stone in the churchyard. Footsteps on the stairs made them glance up. An older woman appeared, her gray hair bound in a knot, a ring of keys at her belt. She was the building's archivist, Mrs. Calloway, and she regarded them with something between suspicion and pity. "You're digging in dangerous soil," she said without preamble. Samuel closed the ledger. "You've seen these records before?" "Seen them? I've kept them under lock since my grandfather's time. He told me never to burn them, never to hide them, and never to speak of them unless the lamps started to fail again." Her eyes moved from Samuel to Clara. "Which I suppose they have." Clara leaned forward. What do you know about the chest? Mrs. Calloway's mouth tightened. Only that it is not meant to be open where people sleep. The last time someone tried, the lamps burned for days after, but no one in the square dared step outside once the sun fell. Something moves in the dark when it's called. Called? Samuel asked. The archivist tapped the ledger's page. The 7 notches. Fill them, and it knows you found it. And it will want to be found again. They left the basement with the ledger's words ringing in their ears. Outside, the noon light was bright, the town alive with ordinary sounds. But Samuel could not shake the sense that the brightness was only a thin skin stretched over something vast and waiting. Clara spoke quietly as they crossed the square. If those black things in the notches are part of it, then it's already awake. Samuel glanced back at the municipal building. In an upper window, just for a heartbeat, he thought he saw the outline of a stooped figure watching them. When he looked again, the glass reflected only the sky. The air outside the municipal building carried the sharp scent of the harbor salt, tar, and the faint oiliness of fish scales drying in the sun. It should have been invigorating, but to Samuel and Clara it felt heavy, as though the daylight had weight. Mrs. Calloway's words clung to them like damp cloth. Never open it where people sleep. They walked without speaking until they reached the edge of the square, where the cobblestones gave way to a packed dirt road leading north. Samuel stopped and glanced toward the distant outline of the coastline, where the land rose in a jagged spine above the sea. There's one place where we might see what this really is, he said. The lighthouse. Clara followed his gaze. The old North Spire lighthouse had been abandoned for nearly 30 years, ever since the new iron-framed beacon was built closer to the harbor. The locals still avoided the place, claiming the light there had once burned without flame or fuel, and that the fog around it never dispersed completely. The road north was lined with weathered houses, their clapboard siding bleached to the color of bone. Laundry hung stiff in the wind, snapping like muted gunfire. A few residents glanced at them from doorways, eyes narrowing as they recognized Samuel and Clara. One old fisherman leaned on the rail of his porch and spat into the dirt as they passed. "You're headed wrong," he called out. "That way's no place for folks who want to come back." Samuel didn't slow. "We won't be long," he said over his shoulder. The man shook his head. "They all say that." By midday, the road began to rise, the sea visible through gaps in the pines. The wind was stronger here, carrying the cry of gulls and the deep boom of waves striking the cliffs. Twice, Clara thought she saw movement among the trees, a flicker of shadow that did not match the sway of the branches, but each time there was nothing when she turned. They stopped at a weather-beaten tavern just short of the headland. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salt pork and stale ale. A woman behind the counter eyed the chest Samuel carried and frowned. "You don't want to be bringing that up there," she said. "The ground's not right. Never has been." Samuel placed a coin on the counter. "We just need directions to the path." The woman didn't touch the coin. "Follow the cliff until you see the black rock split like a jaw. The path starts there. But I won't tell you more than that, because more than that is a burden." She turned away, leaving the coin where it lay. The final stretch to the lighthouse was little more than a footpath carved into the cliffside. The drop to their right sheer and white with crashing water. The building emerged from the mist, slowly a tall, narrow cylinder of stone, its paint long stripped by wind and rain. The lantern room at the top was empty, its glass panes clouded with salt. The heavy wooden door at the base stood ajar, swaying slightly with the wind. Samuel pushed it open, the hinges groaning. Inside, the air was cool and damp, smelling faintly of lamp oil long soaked into the floorboards. A spiral staircase rose along the wall, its iron railing rusted but intact. They climbed slowly, the chest weighing heavily between them. The light from the narrow windows was thin, filtered through layers of mist. About halfway up, Clara paused, her hand tightening on the railing. "Do you hear that?" At first, Samuel heard only the wind. Then, faintly, the sound came like a whisper traveling along stone, rising and falling in a pattern that was almost speech. It seemed to circle the tower, moving faster than the wind outside. At the top, the lantern room offered a view of the gray expanse of sea on all sides. Waves churned far below, and the horizon blurred where water met sky. In the center of the room stood an iron pedestal, its top engraved with the same wheel and 7 stars symbol as the chest. Clara crouched to examine it. "It's been here longer than the lighthouse," she said, running her fingers over the worn grooves. Samuel set the chest on the pedestal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the black beads in the star notches seemed to pulse, like heartbeats, faint but steady. The air in the lantern room thickened, the light outside dimming as if a storm had rolled in without warning. The whispering grew louder, layering upon itself until it sounded like dozens of voices speaking at once, too fast to distinguish words. Clara stepped back. "This is wrong. We should leave it." The pedestal vibrated under the chest, a low tremor that Samuel felt through his boots. Outside, the mist surged upward, wrapping the tower in a shifting shroud. And then, in the white distance beyond the glass, Samuel saw them fade. Elongated shapes moving in the fog, their outlines bending as if the air itself could not hold them steady. One of the shapes turned toward the lighthouse, and though Samuel could not see its face, he felt the unmistakable weight of its gaze. For a long breath, the lighthouse held its silence, and then the room filled with the softest quiver, as if the stone itself remembered a storm. Samuel steadied the chest with both hands. The iron pedestal hummed under his palms, a thread of sound that ran up his arms and settled behind his eyes. Clara stood with her back to the glass, watching the fog turn from a pale veil to a living field that swelled and drew back like a tide turned upright. Outside, the shapes kept their distance, thin as reeds at first, then taller, bending, reforming with each pulse of mist. They did not walk so much as gather, drawn by something older than the lighthouse, older perhaps than the maps that name this coast. The whispering rose and fell in long waves. It was not language at first, more like the idea of words moving just out of reach, the way a thought waits at the edge of sleep. Clara pressed her palm to the cold metal rim of the lantern room. "Listen," she said. Though Samuel was already listening, heart slowed to match the long breath of the fog. In the cadence, he heard a pattern. 7 long murmurs, then one held note, then silence, and again the 7. He found himself counting without wanting to, the way a person counts steps on a staircase they have climbed too often. He looked down at the chest. The 7 black notches in the stars were no longer beads, but tiny wells, dark as ink, each holding a shine that seemed to look back. For an instant, in the closest one, he saw a tiny reflection of the lantern room turned inside out, as if the metal remembered a different sky. "We should close it," Clara said. "Seal it and leave it here." Her voice was steady, but he heard the strain in it, the thread pulled too tight. She had been the one to say not to open it in town. She would be the one to say not to open it here. And yet, here they were, with the chest awake and the sea gathering its shadows. Samuel set his fingers along the lid. It did not lift. There was no visible seam now, only the wheel and the stars, and the shallow wells that pulsed with a slow light the color of old honey. He thought of the letter to the keeper of lights, of the line that said there is no vault. Lies, he thought, are also a kind of map. Below them, the ocean struck the cliff with a sound like fabric torn along the long seam. The lighthouse trembled. A single gull crossed the fog and vanished again. Its cry clipped short as if the air had swallowed the end of the note. Clara moved to the door. If those shapes reach the foot of the tower, we will not make the path before dark. She said it as a fact, not a fear. We should go now, while the wind still favors us. Samuel wanted to agree. He wanted to lift the chest, carry it back down the iron stair, return it to the hatch beneath the lamp, and forget the 7 doors. He wanted to place it in the municipal vault and lock it behind 3 signatures and a seal. But the counting would not stop. 7 murmurs, 1 held note, silence. It threaded through his thoughts the way gas threads a mantle just before it takes the flame. He looked past Clara to the north window. The fog thinned for a heartbeat, and in that brief clearing he saw the coastline as a pale curve, and farther out, something like a ruined causeway just under the water. Black stones laid in a line that led nowhere and everywhere at once. A moment later the mist folded over it. He could not be certain he had seen anything at all. "Help me," he said finally. "If the stars are locks, the wells may be the keys." Clara hesitated, then nodded once. Together they searched the rusted cabinet bolted to the wall, found a packet of long iron pins once used to secure wicks, and returned to the pedestal. Samuel held 1 pin over the first well. The metal shivered in his fingers of its own accord. "Do not let it touch your skin," Clara whispered. He lowered the pen. It met the darkness with a sound like a string plucked in a stone room. A tremor passed through the pedestal and out into the floor. Outside, the 7 murmurs rose in the same instant, then broke off cleanly, as if whatever sang in the fog had turned to listen. One by one they set the pins, 7 in all, each answering a well, each drawing the same low note from the iron. At the last, the chest gave a soft sigh, the lid loosening by the width of a breath. Samuel slid a thumbnail into the seam and lifted. Inside lay a ledger bound in green leather, the color of bottle glass seen underwater. The edges were sealed in wax, stamped with the wheel and the ring of stars. There was also a small object wrapped in oilcloth. He touched neither at first. The air that rose from the chest smelled like a room kept closed for a century. Paper, salt, and a faint sweetness like dried kelp. Clara leaned closer. "Read," she said. He broke the wax, careful to keep the pieces. The first page carried a date, March 3rd, 1763. The hand was the same tight script they had seen in the harbor registry. "Ledger for the continuance of light, to be kept where the sea can hear it." Beneath, a list of names, each followed by a mark, some a neat signature, some only an X. He turned the page. Entries ran in columns, oil and measures, coal and weight, payments in coin, and in favors done without receipt. Between the lines were sentences in a second hand, cramped and slanted, more like a whisper than a record. "When the mists rise for a 3rd day, the lamps are to be kept. When the lamps are kept, the doors stay shut. When the doors stay shut, the water sleeps. The room seems smaller." The fog pressed the glass. A tremor passed through the stair under their feet, something like a footfall too far below to be a person and too regular to be the sea. Samuel unwrapped the small object. It was a ring of brass with 7 teeth cut around the circle, each tooth notched twice. On its inner curve, worn nearly smooth, was a single word, keeper. Clara looked from the ring to the chest. "We have what we came for," she said. "Let us go." He slid the ring into his pocket and closed the ledger. As he lowered the lid, the pins trembled and leapt free as if pushed from below. The wells swallowed their light. Outside, the 7 murmurs did not return. In their place came a single tone, low and steady, like a bell struck too far away to hear with the ears, but close enough to feel in the bones. They carried the chest back to the stair. The first step downward was cold through Samuel's boot. He paused and looked once more through the fog. The shapes were closer now, taller, their edges more sure. The path along the cliff would be narrow in this light, and the wind had turned. They began the descent. The sound of their own footsteps echoed tightly in the iron spiral. Then beneath that came another sound, metal scraping stone, patient and deliberate, climbing upward from deep below. A glance between them, no words, just speed. The sound followed. At the base, the door stood ajar. Fog heavier than outside poured in, curling along the floor. They ran through it, into the open air. The sound on the stairs ceased as if cut. Samuel looked back once. The darkness inside the lighthouse felt dense, watchful. Ahead, the cliff path waited, narrow and slick with mist. They moved into it, the wind pressing them forward, unaware that in the fog just beyond their sight, the tall shapes had begun to walk. The cliff path clung to the edge of the coast like a pale thread, no more than 3 feet wide in some places. On the left, the land fell away to the churning ocean, its black water flecked with foam. On the right, jagged rock rose like the spine of some buried beast. The fog thickened until Samuel could no longer see more than a few yards ahead. Each breath felt cool and damp, leaving a faint taste of salt on his tongue. Behind them, the lighthouse was already a faint blur in the mist, its lantern dimmed by distance and the heavy air. But Samuel could still feel it, the strange, dense stillness of the darkness inside, the sound that had followed them down the stairs. Clara walked just ahead, her shawl pulled tight over her hair, the hem of her skirt brushing against wet stone. She moved quickly, but not recklessly. One slip on this path could send a person tumbling into the sea. Every so often, she glanced over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing at the shapes that flickered at the edge of sight. The shapes did not walk as people walked. They did not seem bound by the incline of the path or the wet stones beneath. They wavered, appearing and vanishing in the rhythm of the mist, but each time they returned, they were closer, their outlines sharper. The wind came from the north now, harder, carrying with it a sound that did not belong to the sea. It was not the gulls, which had gone silent, nor the low groan of the tide against the rocks. It was breathing, slow, deep, and in unison, as though more than one chest filled and emptied at once. Samuel gripped the brass ring in his pocket, the notched teeth pressing into his palm. The warmth of it surprised him. It was as if the metal carried the heat of someone else's hand. He kept his eyes forward. The path bent sharply around a rock outcrop, and beyond it the land widened into a narrow shelf where a half-rotted shack leaned against the cliff face. Its door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and a single rope dangled from a pulley above the frame. A battered sign leaned against the wall, the letters so worn by salt and rain that only fragments remained. "Airy, int. This will do," Clara said. She ducked inside without waiting for Samuel to object. Inside, the shack was little more than a single room with a dirt floor and a smell of damp rope and mold. Coils of hemp hung from the rafters, their ends frayed. In one corner, a wooden crate sat with its lid half off, filled with chipped glass floats and lead weights. The only window was a square cut into the wall, covered in warped shutters that did little to keep out the fog. Samuel closed the door behind them, the hinges shrieking in protest. The sound echoed off the cliff, sharp and thin. For a moment there was silence. Then came the first knock. It was not on the door, but on the wall, far too high for a man to reach from outside. 3 slow taps, spaced evenly. Then another set, lower this time, near the floor. Clara's eyes found his. She whispered, "They know we are here." The breathing was closer now, almost against the wall. The boards creaked, not from the wind, but from weight something shifting just beyond the thin barrier of wood. Samuel crossed the room to the window and eased one shutter open by an inch. Outside, the mist rolled in slow waves. For a moment it was empty, then a figure took shape, not fully human, but not entirely other. Tall, thin, its limbs just a little too long, the head cocked as if listening. Its face, or where a face should be, was pale and smooth, without features, yet Samuel felt its gaze rest on him with unsettling precision. He shut the shutter quickly, the brass latch clicking into place. The warmth of the ring in his pocket pulsed once, faintly. The knocks came again, this time from 2 different places at once, the far wall and the door. Between them, a low hum began, matching the single tone they had heard in the lighthouse. It vibrated through the floorboards, a deep resonance that made the glass floats in the crate tremble. Clara stepped closer to him. "We cannot stay here." Samuel nodded. He reached for the door, then stopped. The hum ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. When he opened the door, the path was empty. The fog seemed thinner for a moment, revealing a stretch of the cliff ahead. Far below, the sea crashed against the rocks. They stepped out, moving quickly now. The wind pressed against their backs, urging them forward. But as they rounded the next bend, the path ahead was no longer empty. 3 figures stood there, tall and unmoving, the mist curling around their legs. They were spaced evenly, blocking the way. Samuel felt the ring in his pocket grow hot, as though warning him. Clara's hand found his arm, her grip tight. One of the figures tilted its head, and the hum returned louder now, vibrating in his chest. There was no way forward, and the path behind them was no longer clear. The 3 figures stood like sentinels, their bodies half lost in the fog. At first, Samuel thought they might dissolve again as the mist shifted, but they did not fade. They waited. Even without faces, he could feel the weight of their attention, a fixed and unblinking regard. Behind him, the path they had come from, filled with a denser wall of fog, darker than before, like smoke caught in a glass jar. Somewhere within it, faint shapes moved, more of them. They were no longer content to follow from a distance. Clara's voice was low. "If we wait, they will close in from both sides." Samuel slid his hand into his pocket and closed it around the brass ring. The warmth was back, steady and deliberate. He felt the notched teeth dig into his skin, almost like the ring wanted to be turned. The figure in the center took a step forward. Its movement was slow but entirely smooth, as if its joints bent differently than a man's. The hum deepened, resonating through Samuel's chest and stomach. The other two began to move as well, their tall frames swaying slightly, like masts in a slow wind. Samuel's first thought was to run for the cliff's edge and climb down toward the jagged rocks below, but the tide was up, and the waves would smash a man to pieces before he could find footing. The only option was forward or through. "Stay close to me," he told Clara. He pulled the ring from his pocket. It seemed heavier now, though the metal glowed faintly even in the dim light. He turned it in his hand, the 7-notched teeth catching against his fingers until they aligned perfectly with the shallow grooves along its inner curve. The hum wavered. The figures paused. Samuel raised the ring, unsure why, but the moment it cleared the height of his waist, the fog nearest him pulled back slightly, as if the air itself had been pushed. The brass was warm enough now to sting his fingers, but he did not let go. The center figure reacted first, tilting its smooth head sharply to one side. The hum stopped, and in its place came a faint whisper, 7 syllables, repeated in a rhythm Samuel recognized from the lighthouse. Clara tightened her grip on his arm. "It's the same pattern," she whispered. 7, 1, silence. The ring's glow intensified. Samuel felt it pulling at something unseen, a kind of tension in the air. He took a step forward. The figures stepped back, not far, but enough to open a narrow space between the one in the center and the one on its right. "Now," Samuel said, and they moved. Clara went first, her skirts brushing against the damp stone as she slipped through the gap. Samuel followed, the ring held out before him. As he passed the center figure, he felt a cold like seawater in winter, a numbing chill that sank into his bones. Then contact. A hand, impossibly long-fingered, brushed his shoulder. Pain lanced through him, sharp and electric. His knees buckled, but the ring's heat surged, driving the cold back. The figure withdrew its hand, and for the first time, Samuel thought he saw something like a reaction, a ripple along its surface, as if disturbed water had caught the shape of wind. They cleared the line of figures and broke into a run, the path narrowing again. Behind them, the hum returned, louder, joined by more voices. The cliff curved ahead, and in the brief distance, Samuel saw a narrow wooden bridge spanning a cleft in the rock. Beyond it, the land widened into a grassy slope leading toward the faint outline of buildings. The bridge swayed in the wind, its ropes frayed, planks slick with mist. Clara hesitated only for a heartbeat before stepping onto it. The wood groaned under her weight. Samuel followed, every step sending vibrations through the structure. The drop below was dizzying foaming water smashing itself into the stone. Halfway across, the hum grew into something closer to a chant, low and rolling, as though the cliff itself joined in. From the mist at the far end of the bridge, another figure emerged taller than the others, its head nearly brushing the ropes overhead. It stood in the middle of the exit, unmoving. Clara stopped. "We can't go back," she said. Samuel tightened his grip on the ring. The heat was almost unbearable now, but he raised it higher, the glow casting faint reflections on the wet planks. The tall figure shifted, turning its faceless head toward the light. The chant faltered. Samuel stepped forward. The ropes creaked. Below, a wave smashed against the rock, sending spray through the gaps in the planks. When he was 3 steps from the tall figure, it moved not away, but aside, stepping to the very edge of the bridge to let them pass. As they did, Samuel felt the cold again, but weaker this time, as if the ring's glow kept it at bay. Once on solid ground, They ran until the bridge was hidden in the fog. The chant did not follow. The only sounds were the wind and the distant crash of the sea. Ahead, the grassy slope descended toward a cluster of dark, weathered buildings, what remained of the old harbor settlement. No lights burned in the windows. Clara slowed. If they are not behind us, they may be waiting ahead. Samuel slipped the ring back into his pocket, though the heat still lingered against his skin. Then we will find out, he said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. They moved down the slope, unaware that from the cliffs behind them, the tall figures still watched, unmoving, their forms dissolving back into the mist. The slope led them down into a hollow where the wind seemed to lose its voice. The constant roar of the ocean was still present, but muffled, as though the air itself absorbed the sound. The cluster of buildings ahead emerged from the mist like the ribs of a long-dead animal, their wooden frames warped and darkened by decades of salt and rain. The main street was a narrow stretch of uneven cobblestone, lined on both sides by storefronts with broken windows and doors hanging open. Faded signs swung on rusted chains, the lettering almost erased by time. Samuel caught fragments as they passed. Mercantile, Chandler, salted goods. The smell here was different, not just the usual damp wood and seaweed, but something faintly metallic like rust or old blood. Clara slowed her steps, her eyes moving from one building to the next. It has been empty a long time, she said softly, though her voice carried in the silence. They passed a row of barrels stacked against the wall of an old fishmonger's shop. The lids were gone, and inside each barrel lay a heap of stones, slicked and black, as if dredged from the deep. A long rope trailed from one, disappearing through a crack in the shop's open doorway. Samuel felt a prickle at the back of his neck. He glanced up. Several stories above, in the window of a boarding house, a curtain swayed slowly. There was no wind. They turned a corner and found themselves in a small square, at the center of which stood an old well. The stonework was worn smooth, and the wooden cover that should have sealed it was missing. Instead, a circle of white shells had been laid around its edge, each shell turned so its hollow faced inward. Clara crouched to look closer. These were placed here deliberately. Samuel peered into the well. The darkness inside seemed too deep for its size, the way a narrow crack in rock can sometimes lead to a cavern. As he leaned forward, the faintest echo drifted up, a sound like the last sigh of a tide pulling away from shore. They moved on, following the curve of the street toward the docks. Here, the air smelled sharper, saltier, and the boards underfoot groaned with each step. Most of the boats tied to the pilings were long rotted, their hulls cracked and green with algae. But one vessel, a small two-masted schooner, looked almost intact. Its name, painted in flaking white on the bow, read Clarabelle. Clara stopped short. That is my name. Samuel frowned. It is also the name of the ship, yes. But I have never been here before. No one in my family. She trailed off, shaking her head as if to clear it. The schooner rocked gently, though the water was still. The sails were furled, but a length of rope ladder dangled from the deck to the pier. Without a word, they climbed aboard. The deck was slick underfoot, the boards dark with moisture. A faint hum lower than the one they had heard from the figures seemed to come from somewhere below. They descended the narrow companionway into the cabin. It was lit by a single oil lamp, though neither of them had lit it. The flame was steady, casting long shadows over the table in the center. On the table lay a rolled chart, its edges damp. Samuel unrolled it carefully. It was a map of the coast. The lighthouse was marked with a small black circle, and the cliff path they had taken was drawn in fine ink. But there were other marks, 7 of them placed inland in a loose spiral. Each was labeled only with a number. Clara traced the spiral with her finger. 7 like the teeth on the ring. As if in answer, the brass ring in Samuel's pocket grew warm again. A sound above made them both freeze. A single slow footstep on the deck, then another. Samuel doused the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. The footsteps continued, measured and unhurried, crossing from one side of the schooner to the other. Something scraped lightly against the railing. Then came the whisper. It was not words exactly, but the rhythm of it was the same as before. 7 beats, a pause, 1 beat, silence. Samuel reached for the ladder to climb back up, but Clara caught his arm. Her eyes, barely visible in the darkness, were wide. Look. At the far end of the cabin, the small porthole was no longer dark. A pale shape moved past it, too tall to be a man standing on the dock. Its surface shimmered faintly, like wet stone under moonlight. The footsteps stopped. The whisper faded. The schooner shifted slightly in the water, as if something had stepped off it. Samuel waited, listening, until even the creak of the pier was gone. Only then did he climb back up. The deck was empty. The fog had thickened again, hiding the shore from view. From somewhere deep in the mist came a sound that made his skin crawl a splash, followed by a long, low moan that seemed to rise from under the water itself. "We should leave the ship," he said. Clara nodded. But as they turned toward the rope ladder, Samuel glanced back at the table. The chart was no longer there. In its place sat a single white shell, its hollow side turned toward him. They left the schooner quickly, the wet rope ladder swaying under their weight. The pier felt colder now, each plank slick with the film of moisture that clung to the air. Clara kept glancing over her shoulder as they moved, but the fog behind them was so thick it might as well have been a wall. The narrow street leading back into the heart of the harbor was even quieter than before. The wind had dropped completely. Without it, the mist seemed heavier, pressing close, carrying the faint scent of salt and something else, something sour, like rotting kelp. Halfway down the street, Samuel heard it, the distant sound of water moving where it should not. It was not the steady rhythm of waves at the shore, but a heavier, deliberate surge, as if something large was wading through the shallows. They reached the square with the well. Samuel slowed, his eyes drawn to the ring of white shells still circling it, but something was different. The shells had shifted, all of them now pointing outward, away from the well's mouth. Clara followed his gaze. That was not like that before. Before Samuel could answer, a sound rose from the well, a bubbling gurgle that deepened into a low, almost human groan. The dark inside the stone shaft seemed to pulse, as if water far below was rising. A wet, dragging noise echoed from the street behind them. They turned. Through the fog, the outline of something massive took shape. It moved with the slow inevitability of the tide, its surface gleaming as though slicked with oil. Samuel could not see legs, only a broad, shifting base that left a dark, glistening trail across the cobblestones. Clara grabbed his arm. "Go." They ran, boots striking hard against the uneven stones. The sound followed slow, but relentless. Every turn they took through the twisting streets seemed to lead them closer to the docks again, as if the town had rearranged itself. At one point, Samuel caught sight of movement above. In the upper window of the boarding house, A tall, faceless figure watched them, its head turned unnaturally far to track their path until the fog swallowed it from view. They came to a narrow alley that sloped upward toward the cliff. The air here was sharper, the smell of the sea stronger. Samuel thought they might have found a way out until he saw the water. It was at the top of the alley, not the bottom. A black, glassy sheet of it stretched across the street, quivering slightly, as if held back by nothing but air. Clara's breath caught. That is not possible. The sheet rippled, and from its surface rose a pale shape, an arm, long and boneless, ending in fingers that swayed like strands of kelp. Another arm followed, then the faint outline of something taller than the buildings on either side, its form shimmering with the same unnatural wetness as the thing they had seen in the street. The brass ring in Samuel's pocket grew hot enough to burn. Without thinking, he pulled it out. The moment the ring cleared his coat, the water in front of them shivered violently. The long arms froze, suspended mid-reach. A sound like 1,000 whispers at once filled the alley, rising from the wet stone, the fog, even the air between them. It had no words, yet Samuel understood the meaning in his bones. You should not be here. The heat in the ring surged, almost painful now, and Samuel held it higher. The water's surface began to pull back, folding in on itself until the street beyond was clear again. Clara seized his arm. Now! They ran past the retreating water, the brass rings glow, lighting the stones underfoot. Behind them, the whispers grew frantic, overlapping in a rising pitch, but they did not look back. The alley opened onto a steep path carved into the cliffside. The ocean roared far below, the wind returning in sudden, violent gusts. Samuel risked a glance over the edge and saw the black water churning against the rocks, as if something massive moved just beneath the surface. They climbed quickly, the mist thinning as they rose. At the top of the path, the land leveled into a stretch of windswept grass. In the distance, the faint light of the lighthouse glimmered through the fog, an impossible distance from where they had started, yet somehow it called to him. Clara slowed, catching her breath. It is leading us back, she said. Samuel nodded grimly. Then whatever waits there is not finished with us. The brass ring had cooled again, but Samuel kept it in his hand as they crossed the open ground. The grass hissed in the wind, and in that sound, he thought he heard the faint rhythm of the chant. 7 beats, a pause, 1 beat, silence. From the cliffs behind them, the moan of the sea rose once more, and with it came the knowledge that the tide was no longer the only thing moving toward them. The grassland narrowed into a ridge, the sea on one side and a steep wooded slope on the other. The wind tore through the open space, carrying with it fragments of sound-low voices that seemed to come from far below, and the hollow clatter of something striking wood. Samuel gripped the brass ring tighter, feeling its grooves bite into his skin. Ahead, the light of the lighthouse pulsed faintly, but with each flash, Samuel noticed something disturbing. Between the blinks of light, the shape of the tower seemed to change. One moment, it was the familiar cylindrical structure of stone and iron. The next, it appeared taller, narrower, with an angular spire that had never been there before. Clara caught up to him, her face pale in the moonlight. It is changing, she whispered, confirming he was not imagining it. They pressed on, but the ridge soon dipped into a shallow saddle between 2 hills. The grass here was flattened in long, parallel lines, as though something massive had passed through, dragging itself toward the cliffs. The smell was strong salt and rot mixed with the faint tang of iron. From the slope to their right came the creak of wood again, followed by the dull ring of metal. Samuel slowed, peering into the dark shapes of the trees. For a moment, the wind dropped, and in the stillness, he saw them. 7 figures stood among the trees, evenly spaced in a perfect arc. They were tall, their heads brushing the low branches, and their limbs seemed to bend too many times. Each held something in its hands, a long, thin pole with a lantern at the top. The lights were not flame, but pale, cold orbs like frozen moonlight. The figures did not move. They simply watched. Clara's breath quickened. They are the same as in the fog. Samuel nodded, his voice low. And there are 7, like the marks on the map. As if the mention of the number was a cue, the figures began to move not toward them, but in a slow, synchronized step that closed their arc around the path. The cold lantern swung gently, casting thin beams that made the mist glow. Samuel turned to run, but the way ahead was no longer clear. The grass there had risen, impossibly, curling into long, rope-like strands that twisted across the path. The brass ring warmed again, faint at first, then more intensely. Samuel lifted it high, and the warmth surged into a steady heat. The figures halted mid-step, their lanterns dimming. For a moment, the mist thinned, and Samuel saw something else behind them structures, not of stone or wood, but of dark metal, their shapes alien and wrong. The vision lasted only a heartbeat before the fog closed in again. Clara grabbed his sleeve. We cannot go forward or back. There must be another way. To the left, the ridge dropped steeply toward the sea, but Samuel spotted a narrow ledge that clung to the cliff face, partially hidden by tufts of grass. Without waiting for the figures to move again, they scrambled toward it, the earth crumbling under their boots. The ledge was only wide enough for one person at a time, and the drop to the rocks below was sheer. Waves smashed against the base of the cliff, sending spray up to dampen their faces. They moved slowly, pressing against the cold stone. Halfway along, a voice reached Samuel clearer than any of the whispers so far. It was deep, resonant, and impossibly close. You carry what was ours. Samuel stopped dead. The voice came not from behind, but from inside his head, vibrating through his bones. The ring burned in his palm, the heat almost unbearable. Clara noticed his stillness. What is it? They know about the ring. The voice came again, louder. 7 opened, 1 remains. Return it. The ledge curved inward, leading to a small, half-collapsed archway carved into the cliff. Inside, the air was dry and still, untouched by the wind. The walls were marked with deep grooves, each one forming a strange, jagged symbol. In the center of the floor lay a circular stone, cracked in places. 7 recesses were carved into its surface, each the size of a coin. 6 were filled with discs of tarnished brass, each etched with a different mark. The 7th was empty. Clara's eyes widened. It is the same number, the same pattern. Samuel looked down at the ring. The notches on its inner band matched the grooves around the empty recess. The voice returned, but now it was layered, as if many spoke at once. Complete the circle. Open the path. The figures appeared at the entrance to the archway, their lanterns flaring to life in unison. The cold light reached across the stone floor, brushing the edge of the empty recess. Clara's grip tightened on Samuel's arm. If you put it in, we might not come back. Outside, the sea roared louder, and from its depths rose that same long, low moan they had heard before. Only now, it was answered by something inland. The air in the chamber grew heavy, and the grooves in the walls seemed to shimmer faintly. Samuel knew they were running out of time. He closed his hand around the ring, the heat pulsing like a heartbeat, and took a step toward the stone. The chamber held its breath. Wind could not enter here. The air beneath the ridge was as still as a sealed jar, tasting faintly of iron and old smoke. Samuel stood above the cracked stone disk and felt the pull of the empty recess the way a ship feels the moon. The brass ring burned in his palm, heat gathering along the 7 teeth, as if a hidden hand were kindling coals inside the metal. Clara watched the entrance. The 7 tall figures crowded the arch, their cold lanterns casting narrow pales of light that met on the floor like spokes. They did not step inside. Whatever rule bound them to the boundary held still, but it might not hold long. The cold light licked the rim of the empty recess and withdrew, as though tasting for weakness. "You do not have to do this," Clara said, though the set of her jaw said she knew he would. "If it opens something we cannot close, then let it stay unfinished." Samuel did not answer. He slid the ring around his fingers until the inner notches aligned with the grooves he could feel, not see. The fit was exact, as if the ring had been cut for this hollow and no other. He lowered it and felt the stone cold the metal's fever. The teeth settled 1, 2, 3 until the 7th touched home with a sound smaller than a click and larger than a thought. The floor woke. Lines no thicker than a quill lit within the stone, flowing outward from the circle in 7 paths. They ran to the walls, found the jagged carvings, and filled them with a dull amber glow. The figures up the arch leaned, not forward but inward, like shadows bending toward a fire they did not love. Somewhere deep below, the earth gave a long, slow sigh. Words formed on the ring itself, letters swelling up through the tarnish like seeds breaking crust. Keep the lamps, keep the sea, keep the door shut. Under it, smaller, when the 7 are set, only the keeper may pass. Clara gripped his sleeve. "Pass where?" the stone answered. The circular slab shuddered and dropped the width of a hand, then turned. Dust lifted in a low breath. A seam opened where there had been none, and with it came that brine-heavy cold they knew from the lighthouse, only purer, older. The circle was a lid. Beneath it, a shaft descended into a light too steady to be flame and too gentle to be day. The figures reacted all at once. Their lanterns flared and went dark, as if snuffed by invisible hands. In the sudden dim, Samuel drew the ledger from his coat and thrust it at Clara. "If I do not return, take this to Mrs. Keene. Burn nothing." Taller, the trust built a door and called it a vault. Clara's eyes shone with anger and fear. "You are not going alone. The letters say only the keeper may pass." He held up the ring. The teeth were sunk into the stone now, fused to the circle, and yet the band lay loose in his fingers, as if cut from itself. "Whatever is below, it will learn my name before it learns yours." He started down the revealed steps, narrow and wet as if the sea had breathed on them for a century. The light from beneath was colorless, the kind that makes edges honest. Behind him, Clara spoke softly, every word a tether. "Count," she said, "so I will know you are still there." 7, he said, and stepped. 6, he stepped again. 5. When he reached 1, the steps ended. He stood on a landing of smooth stone before a door that was not a door. It was a sheet of metal the color of old bone, veined like marble, warm to the eye and cold to the hand. In its center, the wheel and the 7 stars. Above it, in a hand no human scribe could keep steady, a single question. "Will you keep it?" The ring answered without being raised. Heat leapt from his palm into the metal. The 7 stars brightened, went dark, then returned in a softer hue as if satisfied. The sheet parted like cloth pushed by wind. On the far side lay a room the size of a chapel. At first Samuel thought it empty. Then the quiet arranged itself into shapes, a table of stone, a cradle of iron holding a cylinder of black glass, 7 niches along the wall, each occupied by a lamp without flame, and on the floor a map engraved into the rock coast Harbor Ridge lighthouse. At the map's center, a small circle pulsed. It matched the shaft he had descended. He crossed to the cylinder. Inside, suspended in a clear medium that could not be water and would not be oil, something turned with the patience of a tide. It was not a creature, not entirely. It looked like a coil of translucent ribbon threaded with dim light, a length of sea given the idea of breath. When his shadow crossed it, the coil tightened and then relaxed, as if answering a question without words. Samuel set the ledger beside the cylinder and spoke into the hush. "What are you?" The answer came as pressure behind his eyes and heat in his teeth. The same layered voices that had crowded the fog, now shaped into sense, bound current, borrowed deep. Kept here that the harbor should sleep. When lamps fail, door opens. When door opens, sea climbs the stair. He thought of the outages, the disappearances, the way the darkness had moved like a will. Then what took them? What wanted out, the voices said, what we are not. Why the lamps? So the door will not hear its name. He understood, then understood enough to fear it properly. The light above was not comfort, it was a lock. Every mantle tended, every route walked by Fitch and Avery before him, every private circuit funded by the men who hid behind a trust. It was all for this. A tide kept sleeping in a bottle under a town that had forgotten it slept. Behind him, the bone metal whispered. Claire's voice came down the shaft, thin with distance. "Samuel, I am here," he called, and the room listened to how he said it. The ring pulsed against Samuel's skin, each throb sensing with the slow coil of the thing inside the cylinder. Claire's voice still floated faintly from above, a reminder that the world beyond this chamber waited for his decision. He moved closer to the black glass cradle. The fluid inside shimmered, though the room was still. The coil unfurled slightly, strands of dim light rippling through its length like reflections on deep water. Samuel could not tell if it was aware of him or if it had always been aware. The voices came again, but softer now, as if speaking from far away. 7 set, keeper stands, door waits. Samuel's mind went back to the lighthouse, the fog, the strange shapes that moved with deliberate patience. The trust, the marks in the ledger, the empty chair at Fitch's desk. All of it had been leading here, to this choice. "What happens if I remove the ring?" he asked aloud. The answer was immediate, the chamber's air tightening around him. The lamps fail. The sea climbs the stair, and if I leave it, the harbor sleeps, the deep forgets its name. It was a prison. The only question was whether it was mercy or necessity. From the shaft above, Claire called again, sharper this time. "Samuel, talk to me." "I am here," he answered, his voice echoing oddly in the stone chamber. "But I am not sure for how long." The coil inside the cylinder shifted again, and for the first time, Samuel saw something within it in outline, vague but human-shaped, suspended in the twisting light. The form was motionless, hands at its sides, head tilted slightly upward. "Who is that?" he asked. The layered voices faltered. then returned with a tone Samuel had not heard before. The first keeper. He felt his mouth go dry. They're still alive. Alive as the tide is alive, waiting as the tide waits. It struck him then that keeper was not a title passed on willingly. The ring did not choose a successor so much as take one. Clara's voice cut through his thoughts, urgent now. Something is happening up here. The lanterns, they're dimming. Samuel glanced at the 7 dark lamps in their niches. They were steady for now, but the faint hum in the chamber seemed thinner as though stretched. He realized the figures outside, the ones on the ridge, might be more than wardens. They might be counting on the lamps as much as he was. He turned to the map carved into the floor, its glowing central circle marking the shaft. Around it, faint lines pulsed outward to the coast, the harbor, the lighthouse threads of light connecting the chamber to the town above. If one of those threads snapped, the ring grew heavier. Samuel looked down and found that it had fused to his palm, its metal warm and unyielding. He could still feel the teeth of it, still imagine it turning in the stone recess above. He knew now what the trust had never said aloud. The keeper did not just guard the door. The keeper became part of it. He took a step toward the shaft, but the voices surged, sharp and insistent. Keeper stays. The deep stays. The coil in the cylinder drew tighter, light intensifying until the whole chamber glowed. Samuel's shadow stretched across the map on the floor, crossing coastlines and harbors until it fell directly over the central circle. Above, the sound of rushing water began distant at first, then nearer, as though the sea itself had started breathing faster. Clara's shouts blurred into the roar. Samuel stood at the threshold, torn between the steps that would take him back and the gravity that held him here. And then, through the mounting noise, the first keeper's voice, not the layered chorus, but one clear human voice spoke into his ear. If you leave, you will dream of this place until you return. Samuel's breath caught. The voice was tired, but steady, someone who had waited too long to waste words. What are you? He asked, though he already knew the answer. A man who climbed down, as you have, the voice said, and who climbed no further. Why did you stay? Because I was told the sea would not stop. A pause. They were right. The rushing water above was louder now. The edges of the shaft shimmered with reflected light, as though the tide had risen to meet the cliff itself. Clara's voice was gone, replaced by the hollow boom of waves. Samuel closed his eyes. In the darkness behind them, he saw the town. The crooked streets, the dock lanterns swaying, the gulls wheeling above the morning market. He thought of Clara standing in the wind outside the lighthouse, of the ledger's brittle pages, of the generations who had kept this watch without ever knowing what they watched. The choice was no longer abstract. If he left, the sea would climb the stair. He placed his free hand on the cylinder. The glass was cold, but within, the coil loosened as if to welcome him. The ring's heat surged one final time, burning through skin into bone, and Samuel felt something thread itself through his chest, a slow, tidal rhythm not his own. The lamps in the niches flared once, then steadied. The rushing water quieted. The voices receded until there was only the soft hum of the chamber and the distant, constant pulse of the sea. When Samuel opened his eyes again, he was standing not on the landing, but within the map itself. The carved coastline stretched around him like walls, and the central circle rose beneath his feet. He understood then that he would not climb the shaft again, not in any way that counted. Above, in the world of air and daylight, Clara peered down the shaft. She called his name once, twice, but only the echo answered. The stone circle above turned slowly, sealing itself. The ring was gone. On the ridge, the 7 figures lowered their lanterns in unison. The fog began to thin, curling away toward the sea. In the harbor, the water lay flat and calm, as if it had never dreamed of climbing higher. Clara stood there a long time until the wind shifted and the lighthouse's beam swept the cliff once more. She opened the ledger, tracing the ink of Samuel's last notes. At the bottom of the final page, in a hand she did not recognize, a new line had appeared: "The sea sleeps." For now, she closed the book and turned toward the path back to town. The beam of the lighthouse cutting across the night behind her. Far below, in the chamber of stone and light, Samuel watched the coil turn slowly in its glass cradle. And when the tide moved, he moved with it keeper now, until the sea forgot its name again.